Who's that guy in that old shirt? Who must be the fence expert? Who's that guy in that old shirt? Who must be the fence expert? Time to talk about the fences. It's time to discuss operations and expenses. It's time, it's really time to elevate small businesses. It's time for Joe to drop his knowledge. It's relentless. This rhyme of mine is getting a bit ridiculous. Here we go. We're live with Joe. Enjoy the show.
What is up, everybody? Joe Everest, the fence expert, coming to you with another great conversation with the one, the only Andrew Martin, who at this point likely needs no introduction. So today's conversation is actually going to be one of a multi-part series, which is creating a succession plan. And it's really a broad subject, and there's kind of some different paths we can go down. For today's video or today's conversation, we're going to discuss what happens if you don't have a successor in place, which is probably how a lot of companies get started. It's an owner-operator that has found success and is creating their business and their business model. But starting the plan on day one ensures that there is a plan for success, knowing that the plan can change, right? So in subsequent videos, we'll talk about what happens if there is a successor, whether it's a partner, a key person, or maybe it's the next generation coming up and working their way up from the bottom. What happens in each one of these cases is kind of a longer conversation. So rather than try to group all of these into one long conversation, we're going to try to chop these up. Today's video, I think we're going to have a whole conversation only around what happens in the very beginning, or what does a plan look like from the beginning when there's no successor. So Andrew, maybe for the 2 or 3 people out there that haven't seen one of our many other episodes, which they absolutely should, maybe a brief introduction.
Yeah, so I'm founder and president of Atlas Financial Strategies. We're a fee-based business planning, personal financial planning firm headquartered out of Pensacola. We work with clients in dozens of states. And we have found ourselves in the fence contractor world. We work with a lot of different types of contractors, but the fence industry has really been kind enough to embrace us, and lots of really incredible people that we've had the pleasure to work with in the fence industry.
Very good. Very good. So am I right to assume like this is probably a good starting point, right? An owner operator that has likely, maybe they worked for a fence company and they started doing it on the side, or somehow they kind of got started as the owner operator. A lot of folks don't think that this is the time to start planning because they really don't know what it is or where it's going. But the way I think about it is this is probably the best time because it's probably the most simple time to start to plan and then kind of lay the foundation for the succession plan. Does that sound right?
Yeah, so yes, absolutely. And I think when it comes to succession planning, so it's kind of like estate planning, but it's like estate planning for the business, if you want to look at it that way. And I'll kind of start by discussing some of the negative consequences of not having a good succession plan, regardless of what the idea of the plan is. Again, whether we don't have a named successor, or they have a business partner that we might plan to sell it to or something at some point, or a family member, what have you. But we work with businesses of all sizes, relatively small to sometimes even over $100 million a year in revenue. So kind of all over the place.
Nice.
But I will say this is arguably one of the number one things we see that people don't spend much or any time thinking about. And I could count on one hand, if I was missing some fingers, how many times we've worked with business owners that have what I would consider to be a good, thorough, legally binding, well thought out succession plan. Like it almost never happens. So when I say succession plan, I think it's a little bit different than exit strategy, because we need to have a plan for what our plan long term is for the business, because we're all going to leave our business at some point, right? By either accident or design. Sure. So hopefully it goes the way that we want it to, and we're able to successfully exit and hopefully walk away with a pile of money or whatever that means for you, right? But sure. We also need to have that contingency plan for what happens if we leave the business by accident, let's say, by death, disability, something like that. Okay. Right. So that's what, again, to me, when I say succession plan, I mean that contingency plan, which is different, I guess, from ideal exit strategy, which we can talk about at a later date. But what happens, sure. And we've unfortunately seen it happen all sorts of different ways, but what happens if we don't have a plan for what happens to the business if something were to happen to us? So I die and I don't have a plan for my business. My wife, generally speaking, is going to inherit my business interests. Sure. My wife doesn't hold the licenses. She wouldn't know, she's a little bit blissfully ignorant to what I do or do not, kind of have going on and all those things. And that's not uncommon. So she would have to kind of scramble to figure out, all right, what do I do? How do I handle this? I'm going to have to sell it. And, for a lot of business owners, the business is overly reliant upon them. And once they die, with their death, also dies a large portion of the value of the business. So if it's worth, I'm making up numbers, if the business is really relying upon you and with you and all the, and it's worth $10 million, let's say, well, upon your death, it might be worth a lot less than that. Right. So, you just want to make sure to have a good contingency plan for what happens to the business if something were to happen to you. So it's most common that we work with business owners that don't have a good thought of who would, take the reins in their absence.
Sure.
So I'll give you an example. We worked with a contractor type client, still work with him. He's married, got some daughters. He's got 3 daughters. His wife isn't going to take over the business. He doesn't necessarily have any employees or, key people that he wants to give it to. He doesn't have a partner. He has no heir apparent. He has no, apparent successor to the business. And, his business, like a lot of business owners, his business is, 80, 90% of his wealth, right? So, we kind of have the conversation of like, look, man, you got other wealth, other places, you got substantial life insurance, like all the things like, your wife and kids will probably be fine if something happens to you, but it would be a shame for, this 8-figure business to lose a tremendous amount of its value because we neglected to plan, right? So, upon your passing or something like that. So after, lots of conversations and lots of, kind of tossing around ideas of how to handle this, we basically came up with, all right, this is going to need to be sold to a third party. So like a private equity firm or something like that.
Sure.
But we also identified he has currently 3 key people in 3 different departments, divisions, what have you, right? So he's kind of got a office manager type person. He's got a landscape designer, that's his head designer. And he's got a, let's call him like a crew lead. He manages the crews and all those things, right? So he's got kind of 3 key people that, upon his passing, if those employees are like most employees, they're going to go, all right, well, what happens from here? Like, who's writing our paycheck? Are we on a sinking ship? So we start looking for greener pastures. What's happening? So as long as those 3 key people are there, we can hang on to a large portion of the business because he's lucky enough to not be too much in the day-to-day of the business, and not too much of the business relies upon him being there. So he's worked very hard to get to that point, and he is now at that point. So what we did, because we talked about, all right, we're going to have to sell it to a third party, but that could take anywhere from 6 months to 2 or 3 years, even, starting today. So in that meantime, if even one of those key people were to find those potential greener pastures, the value of that business is going to suffer. And that person leaving could cost you millions of dollars, right? So it would probably behoove us to have some sort of golden handcuffs that would financially incentivize those people to stick around through the sale. So what we did was we worked with his attorney to put together a succession plan that upon his passing, and only upon his passing, those 3 key people would each get 5% what's called synthetic equity, or phantom stock, some might call it, but they mean the same thing. And I can explain that if needed. But those 3 key people would get 5% synthetic equity upon his passing. So what that means is that they get 5% of the sale price of the business once it's sold, and they only get that 5% synthetic equity each upon his passing. So he dies, it triggers them getting that 5% synthetic equity. And so what that does is it aligns their interest with his, or, his estates, or, his wife and so on, his family. So what that means is whether it takes 6 months or 2 or 3 years or however long it takes, those people will continue to get a paycheck. And it's in those people's interest to stick around through the sale, because if they left prior to the sale, they get nothing. If they stick around through the sale, then they each get 5% of the sale price, which for him, it made sense to give up 15% of the sale price, 5% each, because if even one of them were to leave, it would cost him more than that, more than likely. So
Makes sense.
upon his passing, they would each get 5%. Upon the sale of the business, they would each get 5% of the sale price of the business. So they want to make sure to stick around through the sale, and they want to make sure that the business sells for as much as possible, because their financial interest is directly tied to it selling for as much as possible. So not just stick around and tootle around, but to continue to run the business successfully and do everything that they need to do to make sure that number one, it can sell, and number two, that it will sell for as much as possible. Now, again, that's for somebody who doesn't have a key person or anything else. It was just like, all right, it needs to be sold to a third party, and this is the way that we need to do that. So that was one way to skin that cat there.
And when we're talking about third parties, I mean, we could be talking about, I mean, private equity is a big conversation right now, coming into the service side of the industry. But it could be through a brokerage, right? Having a broker that identifies a qualified buyer and kind of helps navigate that, which arguably can be a decent process. But probably part of the succession planning would be, maybe identifying, if it is a broker or if it is, probably identifying that person, or at least a firm that says, hey, these are some people that I've interviewed. I feel that they're best qualified to make, decisions in our best interest, that sort of thing. So that I would guess that would be in the succession plan as well.
It certainly could be, and it just depends on the person's preferences. Yeah. So if they have a mergers and acquisitions or M&A advisor, or if they have a business broker or somebody like that they would like to have involved with that, then certainly they can be part of that process and in the documentation to make sure that they facilitate that. Sometimes it's not necessarily needed. As you and I have talked about a little bit before, private equity is, moving into, or has been for the last several years, moving into the fence industry. The big money is here. And generally speaking, as long as the, fence business is well ran and, has all the tenets of, a well ran, marketable, valuable business, there's probably multiple buyers out there chomping at the bit. And just by simply kind of, putting some feelers out, we can probably, because a broker is generally going to charge 5 to 10% of the sale price, which could be totally worth the price, or that could be something that, somebody would like to avoid if possible. But yes, so great point. Certainly could be part of the process.
Got it. So we're talking about things that can and can't be. Is this maybe an instance where you could probably be too detailed into it, and you kind of lock whomever's taking it over into a certain route? So using this brokerage as an example, to where, who knows what the industry looks like for 10 years from now. We say, hey, we'd like you to find a broker. This is or a specialist. This is who I would prefer to use. Whereas in 10 years from now, maybe the industry is completely different, but whoever is managing the estate and trying to manage the sale of the business is kind of locked into a pretty narrow path.
Yeah. So number one, the plan should be put together in a flexible way, knowing that things will evolve and things can change. That's number one. Number two is, yes, so maybe instead of it written up as like, you must use this person, it could be, number one, either you have some backups. You have, all right, well, this person or this firm we want to use, but then we have some backups listed in case that they're no longer serving that industry, or they're no longer in business, or who knows what. Or it could be, I've identified, a list of people or firms that I trust, one or two or three maybe, that, my estate or whoever's in charge of that, my spouse, what have you, could go-to to use, and they decide who to use, but these are the 2 or 3 people that I would prefer them to use because I know them and trust them and so on. So hopefully creating a short list or something like that, not saying that you have to use them, but these are good places to go if you want to use somebody.
Yeah, here's some options. So we're talking about the succession plan itself. Maybe we talk about the main key components and so if somebody doesn't even know where to start, what are some key components of what the succession plan might include? I mean, I understand every situation is a little bit different, but for someone sitting and watching at home that doesn't even know where to start, are there some just overview, like 30,000 foot view key components that should be in this?
Yeah. So, I mean, it needs to identify what happens if you were to exit the business, generally by either death or disability. Now, if you have partners and things like that, there's other things that need to be included in that, such as the retirement of a partner or what happens in a divorce and all sorts of other stuff. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, so generally death and disability are kind of the 2 things that for a solo, a sole owner of a business, those are the 2 things that are going to take them out. Now, I hear kind of all the time when we talk about disability of the business owner, a lot of business owners will say, well, if I'm disabled, I'll just continue to, draw a check from the business. And it's like, all right, I want you to do me a favor. I want you to take the next 6 months off from the business. And when I mean off, off. You are not setting foot on the premises, and you're, no phone calls, text messages, emails, nothing. You are excommunicado from the business for the next 6 months. And then tell me how you feel about that thought. If it makes you sweaty, well, then maybe, your paycheck isn't as, like if you could just step away from the business and continue to draw a check from the business, then why are you showing up every day? Right. So like, why are you there every day if the business can run without you and you to continue to draw a check? Right. So I hear that all the time, and I think that's a flawed way of thinking. But again, those are generally the 2, death and disability. So if you are kind of useless to the business, what happens to the business? And those are generally the 2 things that trigger it. And then again, we either need to decide, all right, I don't have a person identified, and then I need to create a plan like the one that I mentioned that we're going to sell to a third party, but if I have key people that need to stick around to make sure the business runs, how do I tie them to the business and all those things? Or if you do have an identified person, and that identified person could be an employee, it could be another, fence contractor friend of yours that's maybe somewhat local or something like that. Just some sort of, y'all have maybe a buy sell with each other or something like that. So I can kind of briefly discuss that for a moment. We'll discuss, employee and, that maybe another fence contractor or something like that. Yeah, so if you have an employee or maybe another fence contractor friend that, again, presumably would be somewhat local to you, right? If you're in Missouri and you have a friend in California that, it maybe wouldn't make the most sense for them to buy that business in Missouri, right?
Sure.
Different ways to structure that. But we have identified a person, again, whether that's an employee or another fence contractor. We've identified the successor, the heir apparent, if you will. So what you're basically doing is entering into a buy-sell agreement with that person. That would say, all right, upon my death or disability, if I am useless to the business, here's what happens, and I've identified you, and you have the right, but not the obligation, to purchase the business. Now, it needs to be written a little bit differently than if we don't have a named successor, because that named successor, you would want to make sure that written in the documentation, they have what's called a first right of refusal. So in other words, without this documentation, your spouse inherits the business. And even if you had this agreement with that person, but they didn't have first right of refusal, your spouse could go sell the business to somebody else, or they could come in and take it over or whatever, right? So in other words, like basically they have first right, but not the obligation to purchase the business. And then if they are in the, if they still want to do that, well, then they can. And the documentation needs to lay out the terms of this. So that way there's no area of disagreement. We've thought of everything we possibly can, and that person and your spouse aren't duking it out about all the things that I'm about to discuss. So we want to make sure that we have accounted for how are we going to value the business upon our passing. Because that will, your spouse wants to make sure to get a fair price. The buyer wants to make sure to get a fair price, right? So how do we reach that fair price? And it's not up to negotiation with them. Two ways to potentially do that are, one, either have a pre-agreed upon formula of how we would value the business that is in the documentation. And I'm just making this up for the sake of an example. I'm not saying that this is necessarily the way that you should do it. But something like 1 times revenue or 1.2 times revenue or whatever times revenue, that's not generally how businesses are valued. But again, I'm just making this up for this example. Yeah. Or you could say, 5 times, the average of the last 3 years EBITDA or profit or what have you. Now, again, that can go a little bit different ways because maybe on paper you're showing less profit than necessary. And anyways, there's all sorts of different ways to do that. But anyway, some sort of pre-agreed upon formula, or you have it said that, all right, well, upon my passing or disability or what have you, upon the triggering event, the business will pay for a third-party valuation to be done. And then basically whatever that third party says the business is worth, if we can agree upon that, well, then we'll sign on the dotted line there. Now, if you had 10 different valuations done to the business, you're going to get 10 different numbers. So as a tiebreaker, if one or both of the parties cannot agree upon whatever that third party valuation says, then the tiebreaker will be the successor will pay for another third party valuation. Your spouse will pay for another third party valuation, and we will average the 3, and that's the tiebreaker, right? So that's the coming up with how it's going to be valued. Then hopefully there is funding, right? So you would want to have, generally speaking, the business or the successor would own a life insurance policy on you, the owner, because that is a pretty cheap way to make sure that tax-free cash is paid right when it's needed. That is hopefully enough to where the buyer can just write a check to your spouse, go with God, and, we're all done here, assuming we've agreed upon the value. Now, you would also want to have some language in there too to say, all right, well, if the life insurance isn't enough, or if we can't get enough funding or what have you, and we have to owner finance. So in other words, if your spouse in this example has to basically finance part of the sale because they can't get funding or the life insurance isn't enough or some combination of those, well, then you would want to pre-agree upon those terms as well. So, and I hear this question all the time when it comes to this sort of stuff. Can't we just agree upon, an interest rate and a payment schedule and, all the things? And there's things that to the normal person, that is perfectly reasonable and makes sense. To the IRS and to the government and all of their infinite wisdom, these things don't make sense. They don't like those things. So basically, you need to have some language in there, something along the lines of, all right, if there's not enough lump sum money in the form of life insurance or outside funding or what have you, my estate or my spouse will owner finance this, and here's the terms. It'll be paid over a 10-year period of time. I'm just making this up as an example. It'll be paid over a 10-year period of time. And for it to be a federally recognized loan, there has to be an interest rate tied to it. So for this to be a federally recognized loan, it has to be tied to what's called the applicable federal rate, or AFR. So that changes all the time. So in other words, we can't just pre-agree upon like, oh, we're going to charge a 3 or 5% or 6% interest rate. We just can't do that and have it be a federally recognized loan. So what the language needs to say is something along the lines of, it'll be a 10-year term, paid monthly, and the interest rate will be AFR plus 1 or AFR plus 2, prime plus 1, prime plus 2, something like that. So that way, whatever AFR is then, we'll just add 1 or 2 percentage points, and then there we go. And we might want to have something in there along the lines of, all right, but also the business will purchase if we have to do a owner finance, that either the business, which is now the buyers, or the buyer personally, they're responsible for buying a life insurance policy in the amount of the loan to make sure that if they die, whatever they owe my wife, they can pay. So they will own a life insurance policy. The business will pay for it. Doesn't matter who pays for it, but my wife is going to be the beneficiary of that policy. And that is part of this, Because again, same deal. What happens is if they die, the only recourse on that loan is that my wife now gets to, they get the business back, which they're back to square one.
It gets to go through the whole thing again.
Yeah, we're back to square one. So we just need to have all these contingencies thought through. And then same thing for disability. If I become disabled, same deal. We've recognized this person. You might want to have a disability policy on yourself, or, same deal as the life insurance, right? How are we going to fund this? How are we going to, that is one of the triggering events. So we just want to have everything accounted for to make sure that, upon my passing, this thing that I've poured my blood, sweat, tears, and sleepless nights and made sacrifices for and missed ball games and done all the stuff, that my spouse and family is compensated fairly for this and not just left holding the bag.
Sure. Makes perfect sense. Makes perfect sense. So when we're talking about all this, I mean, there's some pretty detailed language in here. Mm-hmm. It sounds like this is something, I mean, obviously you want to bring in a professional, but it sounds like we probably would have a couple professionals from, if you're watching one of our earlier videos, from kind of our professionals dream team. It sounds like obviously a financial advisor in some capacity, but also likely a lawyer to look over it, make sure it's compatible to the state you're in.
Yes. So that is a very key part of this. Make sure you have an attorney do it, and make sure that the attorney is, they specialize in that area. I'll share a quick story with you. We worked with a business that there was 3 partners, and they were young guys, and the business really blew up. They were very successful, and they brought us in to, help with like their buy-sell agreement, things like that. So when we got the operating agreement from them that had the buy-sell language in it, we reviewed it, and, one of the attorneys on my team was like, hey, did they write this up themselves? And I was like, well, I don't know. I just asked for it, and this is what they gave me. So I'll ask them. And they were like, all right, well, I just can't. I have a hard time believing an attorney did this. So during the next meeting with them, I had to try to find a tactful and polite way to say, hey, guys, who did this for y'all? And they're like, oh, so-and-so's friend. And I was like, okay, is so-and-so's friend, is he an attorney? Yeah. Does he specialize in this sort of law? And they're like, nah, I think he does like real estate law mostly or something like that. And we just needed to get it done. And I was like, okay, because we thought you did it yourself. Like, this really needs to be redone. And we've also seen some done by attorneys that even if they, maybe this is part of what they do, at least in our opinion, there seem to be some key language or key components missing to the document. So I do think it's worth having a second set of eyes on, whatever is written up. So yes, to your point, hopefully you are already working with a good CPA, because they will need to be at least somewhat involved in this, not overly involved, but at least somewhat involved. The attorney is going to be one of the main components of this because they will be the ones needed to write up the documentation needed. Now, I will say, and this is not a slight to my attorney friends, but the attorneys are generally there to write up the documentation. They are not necessarily there to spend a lot of time talking to you about the components of the plan and how it all works, and really spending time on what I would call the discovery and pre-planning and so on. And then even if, so that's generally where we will come in to, we don't know what we don't know. So we will, discuss with the business owner, how do we want this to go? Right? Who are our key people? Does it need to be sold to a third party? Can we, do we have a recognized kind of heir apparent or successor? And, kind of explaining, here's all the different ways we can do this, explaining to them how it all works, all those things. So that way, by the time we get to the attorney, pretty much all the details are fleshed out. We have a plan put together that is going to hopefully accomplish exactly what we want it to accomplish. And now the attorney is there to do what they do and write up the documentation based on the plan that we've laid out. And then we will put a second set of eyes on that plan, on the documentation to make sure that it says all the things that we needed to say. Because again, even sometimes when we work with the attorney and lay out everything, we'll get a draft of the documents and it won't say exactly what we discussed. And it happens all the time because a lot of times their documentation is all kind of boilerplate, templated, you know what I mean? And they're just putting in, key names and the name of the business and your names and, all the things. So again, sometimes we will, hey, we need to make sure to add this or that in there. But yes, it is very important. And so, you mentioned financial advisor. It is, there are firms out there who work the same way we do, have some of the same specialties we do, all the stuff. But it's very important that it's not just a standard run-of-the-mill financial advisor that's there to like manage and invest money for you, right? They're a key important part too, but I would say probably 95+% of the advisors or planners out there, this isn't in their wheelhouse. So again, I'm not saying it needs to be us, but just make sure you work with somebody who that is like they have hopefully ample experience with that sort of stuff and can fill that role for you.
Got it. Well, Andrew, I feel like we kind of tiptoed into the next conversation, which is going to be if there is a key person or heir apparent and how to transfer that. So let's save that part of the conversation for the next episode.
Yes, sir.
Because it feels like this might be a good landing spot for this part of the conversation. Again, guys, hear us when we say, please consult professionals when trying to lay this out, right? And not just one, bring in a team. If you haven't watched the videos on what each of those team members would likely look like in terms of expertise, go back and watch that. It's a great explainer on who these people are in general and what they should be good at, questions to ask them, things to talk about with them. But once you narrow it down, this is a good subject to bring up, is that I'd like to talk about a succession plan. I either do or don't have a successor, heir apparent, that sort of thing. And use this conversation really as an outline of what that conversation should look like. Here's some things I'm thinking about. Here's some things I've heard. And this is how I would like to flesh that out. Does all that sound about right?
That's perfect, man. Yeah. So just have somebody that knows this, that you can have a conversation with, to know what your plan should look like, and then put together, if you don't already have the team put together, work on putting together that team and then get it implemented, because the plan is only as good as the implementation.
Absolutely. Well, Andrew, if someone wanted to reach out to you directly, maybe they had a few more questions, or this is something they would like to talk to you about being on their team, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so feel free. So anybody watching, if y'all just want to kind of briefly discuss what we discussed today, I'm happy to take a free call, 30 minutes or so, and just help you identify some key components of it. Whether you hire us or not, doesn't matter. I just want to be helpful. So you can call our office at 850-542-4803 and just tell them that you watched this and you'd like to schedule a free phone call. Or you can go to our website, atlasfinancialstrategies.com. You can request a consultation there. The office will reach out to you and then do, same deal.
Perfect. Very good. Well, Andrew, each and every time we have a conversation, I feel like I take out a few golden nuggets. So I know the folks at home are. I appreciate you being so giving with your time. Every time there's an ask, you're more than willing to come on, and I appreciate you making time for these conversations.
Man, I'm super honored that you would have me on, because you're, one of the most successful podcasts in the industry, one of the most successful podcasts probably, period. And I love being on, man. We have a lot of great conversations. So I appreciate you having me on.
Well, Andrew, I look forward to the next one. Again, guys, the next conversation is going to be what a succession plan looks like if there is a successor involved, whether that's a key person or whether that's an heir apparent sort of thing. Stay tuned for that next time. For now, I'm Joe Everest, reminding you that great fences make great neighbors.